All right, let's dive in. Today, we're looking into Daniel O. Jones.
A convicted serial killer.
Yeah, from Kansas City. You sent us his Wikipedia article,
You're
so
going to break it all down.
exactly, and see, what we can find out. From what I read, this is not a simple case.
Uh-huh.
There were early signs of trouble, like way early. There's a big gap between his first murder and the ones that came after. And DNA is a big part of this.
Yeah, it's crucial in this one.
It really is. And then on top of everything else, it seems like there was some controversy with his plea deal.
It's an interesting case for sure. It really shows you how complex the justice system is, you know. We'll be talking about the events themselves, but also what they tell us about forensic technology, criminal psychology, even the ethics of plea bargains.
Okay, so let's start with what we know about Jones, his background.
Hmm.
The article says he's from Kansas City, born and raised, went to Raytown South High School. But even back then, even in school, there were signs that something was off.
Yeah, there was that incident back in '87. He attacked his teacher.
Right.
And I don't mean just a typical school fight or anything. He dragged her into the auditorium, the school auditorium, and raped her. It's really chilling when you consider what he did later on.
Yeah. And he was convicted for that, sentenced to 10 years. He even tried to appeal the sentence in '89.
Unsuccessfully.
Yeah, no luck. It makes you think, did this whole experience with the legal system, did it shape him in a way? Did it contribute to what he did later?
It's possible. Trauma and time in prison, they can have a huge effect, especially when you're young. We should keep that in mind as we try to understand him better, psychologically speaking. So Jones got paroled in '96 and had to register as a level 3 sex offender. That means they thought he was very likely to offend again. And tragically, it didn't take long.
2 years later, December '98, the first murder. Janai Douglas, just 19 years old, stabbed to death in her apartment. What's really disturbing is that Jones, he visited Douglas's mother several times after the murder, offering condolences.
That's a huge red flag. It could be a sign of what we call duping delight. That's when someone gets pleasure from tricking others, fooling them, and it's often linked with psychopathy.
Wow, that's a pretty intense concept. Could you explain that a little more for our listeners? What exactly is psychopathy? How would you see it in someone's behavior?
Sure. Psychopathy is a personality disorder. It's marked by a lack of empathy, no remorse, disregard for social norms, and a tendency to be impulsive and manipulative. People with psychopathy, they can be very charming, very engaging on the surface. It can be hard to spot them.
So in this case, is it possible that Jones, by acting all kind to Douglas's mother, was he trying to hide his guilt? Or was he even enjoying the fact that he was deceiving her?
It's definitely a possibility, and it makes you think about how we can do a better job of recognizing these traits and managing people who show them. We're not saying everyone who has some of these traits is a psychopath, but it's important to know the warning signs. And early intervention, that's key.
That's such a good point. So we have this first murder, and sadly, it's not the last. The investigation into Douglas's death, it kind of stalled, and they offered a reward for information. Then, March of '99, another young woman is killed. Khaliqua Gilliam, 21 years old, stabbed to death in her home, 36 stab wounds. It's hard to imagine that kind of brutality.
Yeah, the level of violence is increasing. It suggests Jones is losing his inhibitions. The rage is becoming less controlled. And it's also notable that both victims were young women he knew personally. That kind of pattern points to a specific type of predator.
And the fact that he killed them both in their homes, that adds another layer of violation. Like he chose to invade their safe spaces.
Exactly. This is where understanding the psychology of the offender is crucial. Why these specific victims? Why these locations? What need was he fulfilling through these violent acts? We'll explore these questions as we delve deeper into Jones's psyche.
Okay, so we're starting to see this pattern. But the police, they still haven't connected Jones to these crimes. Then the article talks about his relationship with Roxanne Colley, 21 years old.
And this is where the case takes another dark turn. Colley becomes Jones's third victim, found murdered in her apartment in August of '99. Like the others, she was a young woman Jones knew, and the murder happened in her home.
But this time, it was even more brutal. The article describes a really violent scene. Colley was sexually assaulted, and her throat was slashed.
That level of sadism often points to a deep rage, a need for power and control. It's a disturbing escalation from the previous murders and gives us a chilling glimpse into Jones's psychological state.
And it makes you wonder, were there any missed opportunities? Could someone have recognized the warning signs, maybe even prevented these tragedies?
That's a question that often haunts investigators and the families, too. We'll come back to that as we examine the role of law enforcement and the potential for early intervention in cases like this.
All right. The article then talks about Jones's relationship with another woman, Candrea White. She was a young mother, had 2 kids, and their relationship, like the others, was full of conflict and instability.
And in March of 2001, it led to a brutal attack on White in her apartment. Jones stabbed her multiple times and slit her throat. He left her there, thinking she was dead.
It's unbelievable that anyone could survive that. But luckily, White did survive.
She did, and that attack is what finally led to Jones being caught. They found a bloody palm print at the scene, and it matched Jones's prints.
So his own carelessness got him in the end.
Exactly. It shows that even the most careful criminals can slip up. And in this case, that mistake had huge consequences.
Because once they had him, the whole investigation changed. DNA evidence linked him to Roxanne Colley's murder, and he was charged with her murder and the attack on Candrea White.
And here we see the power of forensic technology. DNA evidence, which was still pretty new in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was key in connecting Jones to his crimes.
Makes you think, if those earlier murders happened today, maybe they could have been solved sooner with the DNA technology we have now. But unfortunately, we can't change the past. All we can do is learn from these cases and see how they can inform our understanding of criminal investigations and forensic science.
Absolutely. Every case teaches us something. The advancements in DNA technology have been revolutionary for criminal justice.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've seen a pattern of violence. We've got a glimpse into the possible role of psychopathy. We've seen how powerful DNA evidence can be in getting a conviction. But there's still so much more to uncover.
In the next part, we'll go deeper into the ethical side of things, especially the plea deal, which was pretty controversial. It allowed Jones to avoid the death penalty. We'll also look at how these crimes affected the victims' families and the wider community.
It's going to be a tough conversation, but a necessary one. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into the disturbing case of Daniel O. Jones.
That plea deal, it really does raise some tough questions about justice, about what it means to be held accountable.
Yeah, no doubt. So Jones, he confessed to all 4 murders back in 2004. It was part of a deal to get him off the death penalty. It must have been so hard for the families to finally have answers, but also to know that he wouldn't face the ultimate consequence.
Absolutely. I mean, some people would say that any confession, no matter how it comes about, it brings some closure.
Right.
It means he's admitting to what he did. And it also saves the families from having to go through a long, drawn-out trial, which can be really painful.
But then there's the other side. Some people would feel that real justice means the harshest punishment, especially for crimes this terrible. It makes you ask, what does justice really mean in these situations? Is it just about punishment, or is it also about getting answers, finding some kind of resolution?
It's a tough question, ethically speaking, and there are good points on both sides. We have to remember each case is unique, its own situation.
And for Jones, that plea deal meant the investigators could finally close the cases on those first murders, even though the DNA evidence wasn't 100% clear.
Right, and that brings us to another really important point, forensic technology. We talked about how DNA connected Jones to Roxanne Colley, but it's worth thinking about how much that technology has changed since then.
I was thinking about that too. Back when this all started, late 90s, DNA analysis wasn't as advanced.
Exactly. Now investigators can use DNA to find suspects way more accurately and quickly. They can even work with really small samples or DNA that's been degraded, things they couldn't do a few years ago.
So just thinking out loud here, if these murders happened now, do you think it would have been different? Could they have caught Jones sooner?
It's hard to say for sure, but maybe. With better DNA techniques, they might have been able to link him to those earlier murders faster. But we can't forget that technology is just one part of it. Good police work, thorough investigations, people willing to come forward as witnesses, those things are still crucial.
That's a good point. Technology helps, but it's not a magic solution. You always need the human element.
Absolutely. Now, something I noticed when I was looking into this case, the media coverage, or rather the lack of it.
I saw that too. It didn't seem to get as much national attention as some other serial killer cases. Makes you wonder why.
Right. One possibility is, well, it could be because of who the victims were. We've seen it over and over. Cases where the victims are from marginalized communities, especially women of color, those cases don't always get the same attention from the media as cases with white victims.
That's a disturbing thought. but unfortunately it's true. There's a lot of research that shows how biased media coverage can be. It's important that we know about these biases and try to find different viewpoints.
I couldn't agree more. We should all be critical of what we see in the media and try to understand the bigger picture, the social context of these stories.
So getting back to Jones, we've talked about the plea deal, DNA technology, the lack of media coverage. But now I want to talk about something that's often overlooked in cases like this, the impact on the families.
You're right, that's crucial. Losing someone to murder, it's an unimaginable trauma. And it affects so many people, not just the immediate family, friends, coworkers, the whole community.
And with Jones, we're talking about 4 families who had to deal with this horrible loss. It's hard to comprehend the pain and grief they must have gone through.
It's important to remember, behind the headlines, behind all the legal stuff, there are real people whose lives were shattered. These victims, they were daughters, sisters, friends. They had dreams, ambitions, relationships that were cut short.
And the people who loved them have to keep living without them, forever changed by this loss. I bet the fact that Jones got out of the death penalty made it even harder for them.
Understandably, they would feel like justice wasn't served, especially given how brutal the crimes were. It shows we need a system that holds people accountable, but also supports the families of the victims.
Support's really important. There are organizations out there that offer counseling, advocacy, and other help for families after a homicide. We need to make sure people know about these resources so they can get help if they need it.
Absolutely. It's easy to focus on the investigation and the legal aspects, but we can't forget the human cost.
Right. Before we get to the last part of our deep dive, I want to go back to Jones's psychology. We talked about psychopathy, but could there be other things that contributed to his violence?
That's a good question. It's important to remember psychopathy might be a factor, but it's rarely the only explanation. There are usually other things going on: the environment, social pressures, things that make a person vulnerable.
So with Jones, there's his history of violence, the time he spent in prison. Could those experiences have shaped how he saw the world, made him more likely to be aggressive?
It's possible. Seeing violence, especially when you're young, it can desensitize you. You might become more likely to be violent yourself. And prison, well, it can be a brutal place that reinforces bad behavior.
It's a terrible cycle. It shows how important rehabilitation programs are. Programs that try to get at the root causes of crime and give people the tools to break free.
Exactly. Just punishing someone, it's not enough. We need a system that focuses on holding people accountable, but also giving them a chance to change.
Well said. And I think that leads us right into the final part of our deep dives. We'll talk more about rehabilitation and whether it's really possible, even in cases as difficult as this one.
I'm looking forward to that. It's a topic with a lot of ethical and social implications.
So we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've been talking about Daniel O. Jones, and we've covered a lot, the details of his crimes, how DNA technology played a role, the whole plea deal situation. Now I wanted to talk about something really crucial: rehabilitation. Can someone who's done these kinds of awful things, can they really change?
It's a question that's been around forever, and there's no simple answer. It gets into psychology, sociology, ethics, even philosophy. When we talk about rehabilitation, what we're really asking is, can someone change their core beliefs, their values, their behavior? And with someone like Jones, someone who's so violent, so lacking in remorse, it's a really tough question.
So what do experts look at when they're trying to figure out if someone can be rehabilitated?
Well, there are a few things, but some of the most important are, does the person show remorse? Are they willing to admit what they did? Can they feel empathy? Other things matter too, like age, mental health history, whether they have substance abuse problems.
Sounds like it's different for everyone. No easy answers, huh?
Exactly. Everybody's different, and their path to rehabilitation is going to be unique. There's no magic formula. You can't predict what's going to happen.
No, with Jones, the article didn't really mention any specific attempts at rehabilitation. And the fact that he confessed to get a better deal, not because he was truly sorry, it makes you wonder about his motives.
Right. That lack of remorse is a big concern. It suggests maybe he doesn't fully understand what he did or the pain he caused. And if you don't have that basic understanding, that willingness to change, rehabilitation becomes very difficult.
So does that mean it's impossible in cases like this? Is punishment the only option? Keeping them locked away?
Not necessarily. I mean, it's definitely harder when you're dealing with extreme violence and a lack of remorse. But we have to remember, even the hardest criminals, they can have moments where they reflect, where they grow. There are cases where people who did terrible things, they changed. They went through intense therapy, spiritual guidance, or sometimes just, time itself.
That's actually kind of hopeful.
Yeah.
It shows that even in the worst situations, there's always a chance for change.
That's right. Never underestimate the human capacity for change. But we also have to be realistic. Rehabilitation's complex. There are no guarantees.
And I'm guessing the type of crime matters too. Is it easier to rehabilitate someone who, say, committed a crime in a moment of passion as opposed to someone who planned it all out, was cold and calculated?
That's a tricky one. It really depends on the specifics of the case. But generally, crimes that happen impulsively, out of strong emotion, those might be seen as more open to rehabilitation. You might be able to address those underlying emotional triggers. But crimes that are planned, where there's a deliberate disregard for life, those are much harder to deal with. They often point to very deep-seated beliefs and values.
It's complicated, that's for sure. And it brings up ethical questions too, like how much is society obligated to provide opportunities for rehabilitation? And what about when someone is considered too dangerous to be released, even if they've shown some progress?
Those are important questions. There's always this tension, between keeping the public safe and believing in the possibility of redemption. And there are no easy answers. Each case is different, its own set of challenges. It's a constant balancing act.
And I imagine the victims' families have a lot to say about this too. They've suffered a tremendous loss. Their voices need to be heard.
Absolutely. Crime has a profound impact on victims and their families. It lasts a long time. Their perspectives are vital in helping us understand justice and rehabilitation. And while their pain and anger are completely understandable, it's important to remember that forgiveness and healing are possible, even after the most horrific events.
Well, this brings us to the end of our deep dive into the disturbing case of Daniel O. Jones. We've explored the chilling details of his crimes, looked at how forensic technology played a role, and the ethical questions surrounding the justice system. We even talked about the possibility of rehabilitation. What are some of the key things you hope our listeners take away from this?
I think the main takeaway is that these cases are never simple. They make us question what we think we know about human nature. They show us the cracks in our systems, and they force us to face some hard truths about ourselves, about society. The darkness that Daniel O. Jones represents, it's frightening, but it also reminds us how important empathy is, compassion, and believing in the possibility of change. Even in the face of terrible acts, we have to hold on to hope. We have to work towards a world where these kinds of things happen less often.
Thank you so much for taking us through this really complicated and thought-provoking case. It's been incredibly insightful. And to our listener, we encourage you to keep thinking about these issues, to talk about them with others, and to use what you've learned to make the world a more just and compassionate place.